This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Fine. With me is Jan Leisher. Jan, let's start out by learning something about you.
Good afternoon, Terri. Yes, I'm Jan, and I'm from Bridgewater Middle School, and I teach the gifted and talented, and right now I teach civics and U.S. history to 7th and 8th graders.
And how do we meet, Jan?
Well, we met through a civics program that I attended last year, and it has been my pleasure to work with you and to learn so much more about civics.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for being a part of this conversation. We're going to talk about the concept of federalism and how the Constitution can help us understand the federal system. Jan, tell me where you'd like to start.
Well, I think we ought to start at the beginning. What is federalism? Because I think that's an important thing for us to understand as we begin.
That's a great question, Jan, because when we talk about federalism, we're really talking about the relationships between the national government, the state governments, and the local government. So we're really talking about the interrelationships between the national, state, and local government. One of the reasons why it can be so confusing is because we often say that our national government is a federal government. It's a federal system that talks about the interrelationships, but we also use the word federal government when we mean national government.
And that's really difficult for students sometimes to understand because we have to be careful in the language that we use so that we don't confuse them further in understanding the difference between federal government and national government. I guess another question I have is, wasn't there some debate about whether we even needed a federal government or a federal system? And then, what about the Bill of Rights that comes with that? What were the discussions like between the Founding Fathers? There's so much in this area.
There is so much, and I'm going to deal with each of your questions individually.
Good.
You know, when we're talking about why do we have a federal government, that's such a great question because there was no federal government in place when the United States, as we know it today, created this federal system. The United States had been functioning under what we call the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation was, as the name suggests, a confederal or a state-centered system. And the Articles of Confederation were put into place after the colonists declared independence from King George III. King George III represented a monarchy, or what we call a unitary system. All the powers of government were in one place, and we as colonists were unhappy. So we declared our independence, and then we said, well, what's the furthest thing from a unitary system that's a confederal system? But after about 10 or 11 years, it was very clear that a state-centered system wasn't going to work, that we had to set up a system of shared powers between the national government and the state government so that the state governments would enjoy some powers on their own. The national government would deal with the nation as a whole and some specific needs, such as national defense, for example, or national unity. And there were also going to be powers that were going to be shared between the national and the state governments. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to give you some examples.
Well, I think examples always make it better when we're in a classroom for students, so it would certainly make it better for me.
Well, you know, the one thing that we're all the most familiar with is taxes. And we know that the federal government, or national government as we call it, can tax us. We have a federal income tax, for example, that's part of the U.S. Constitution. And the state governments also have powers all on their own, and those powers are given to the state governments in the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And basically what the 10th Amendment says is that the states can do whatever they want as long as there's not a federal law that speaks otherwise, that either contradicts it or says something differently. So the one thing that we might be familiar with is elections. The national government decides on what date we're going to hold national elections, but the state governments decide whether or not we're going to have a primary for elections and on what date that primary is going to take place. So both of them have laws regarding elections, but they're not shared because the date is set by the national government and the primary system is set up by the state governments. We also have taxes. We have sales taxes at the state level. We have federal income taxes at the national level. So there are some powers that are shared as well. When we use the term shared power, what we're talking about is concurrent powers. When there are powers that just the states have, those are reserved powers, or powers reserved to the states. So those are some examples that we might all be familiar with: taxes and elections.
And the Bill of Rights, did we need a Bill of Rights?
You know, that's a great question. And the person who wrote the Constitution, James Madison, he's the primary author. There were other authors, of course. But the question came up about whether or not we even needed a federal government. And James Madison was very committed to this idea that we had to have a shared power system. Well, those who really believed that the state should have all the power and then the system of confederation just needed a little bit of tweaking, they said, look, we really don't want to give up all this power to this national government because we fear that the national government will become abusive with its power. How about a Bill of Rights? And Madison suggested that there be a compromise. And the compromise was there would be a Bill of Rights after the Constitution itself was ratified. So Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, but it wasn't until 1789 that the Bill of Rights was introduced as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they were ratified in full and added to the federal Constitution in 1791. And indeed, that Bill of Rights, many people say, was really critical to getting those states that didn't want to give up power to give up some of their power because they felt that the Bill of Rights would protect them from the federal government, which they feared would be abusive with its power.
Sounds like there was a lot of trust between these framers of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. We use those two terms quite a bit, Founding Fathers, framers of the Constitution, yet they were some of the same people. Can you help us understand a little bit more about those two groups?
Well, it's interesting because they were really in a position to try to do something new. Even when the Articles of Confederation were put into place after the Declaration of Independence, there weren't any role models in the world. There weren't any role models around the country, around the world, that would say, oh, well, we've tried the state-centered system. It's worked really, really well. Why don't you have, I don't know, keep it at 13 states. 13's a good number, right? There was no way to tell. And then shifting to a national or federal system, same thing. There were no role models. And so these folks who founded our country also tried to write a government structure, the framing of the government, of the Constitution, that would really stand the test of time. And what we've seen over the last 200 plus years is that this federal system has stood the test of time, but at the same time, even in contemporary days, we find that people are constantly questioning whether or not the national government should have a certain power or the state government should have a certain power. Or when it comes to responsibilities. I mean, many of us have heard about Hurricane Katrina. We've heard about 9/11. In the end, those two, one a natural disaster, one a human-made disaster, ultimately got down to issues about who had what power and who had what responsibility. When it came to Hurricane Katrina, for example, there were questions as to whether or not the federal government was responsible for emergency management or whether or not the state of Louisiana had to take care of itself. Yeah. We look at 9/11, right? The mayor of New York City on September 11, 2001 was Rudolph Giuliani. Rudolph Giuliani, within a few days of 9/11, took a trip, and he took a trip to Washington, D.C. And that was very symbolic that his first trip away was not only so soon after 9/11, but was to Washington, D.C. because he was very clear in saying, this is a national tragedy. Yes, New York City was hit the hardest, but the United States was hit as a nation. But New York City was the geographic place where this disaster was the worst. And so we find that in so many situations, people still continue to have questions about, is the national government responsible for cleaning up after hurricanes? Is the national government responsible for defending all of the borders, for keeping all of the borders secure? Do the states themselves that live either bordering countries or bordering water, do they have some responsibility themselves?
Sounds like a giant balancing act to know who is responsible for what and who you can depend on for certain services or in the event of those emergencies and tragedies, as you spoke.
And many of these are, again, the first time. I mean, if it's the first time that something like this has happened, it's not like there's a playbook that says, oh, well, this is the way they did it 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 10 years ago. This is how it was handled. And so that also creates a lot of conflicts between governors and the president in terms of who's responsible, especially when we're talking about health care. Right? Health care is very interesting. In Florida, for example, Florida has the highest percentage of elderly residents of any state in the country.
Wow.
Florida has no income tax. So how do you care for the elderly in a state that doesn't have that source of revenue? Under the 10th Amendment, the state does not have to have an income tax, and it chooses not to. At the same time, in the 1930s and again in the 1960s, Medicare was created in the 1930s, Medicaid in the 1960s. So is caring for seniors a national issue? Or is caring for seniors a state issue? It's an interesting question, because why do we have so many senior citizens living in Florida? We have a very friendly tax climate, a friendly meteorological climate, right?
Yes, indeed.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering, like, for your students, do they have any other questions about the national and state government and how they relate to one another?
Well, I think they hear so much about taxes that is always something that they're constantly talking about. And so many of them are shaped by the opinions and by the information that they receive from their parents and then from the media. And they seem to think that taxes are a dirty word,
Yes.
As if that is something that, is the worst thing we can possibly have. And so I often try to tell them that taxes are like your allowance. It's what allows you to do certain things. And if you did not have that allowance, you would not be able to do certain things that you want or you need to do. And it's the same way with taxes. And the debate, as I explain it to kids, is always about what do you think the government should do? And when you think about what the government should do for its citizens, then you can kind of decide, whether that type of tax or that amount of tax is something that is necessary. So you just try to constantly make it something that's relevant to them.
Jan, I'm so glad that you brought up taxes, because taxes were one of the big issues to switch from the Articles of Confederation
Absolutely.
to a federal system. Taxes were optional, right? It was a state-centered system. If states didn't want to pay taxes, states didn't pay taxes. If states didn't want to give support for a national military, they didn't. And it created an awful lot of resentment, because that meant that the national government, such as it was, could not defend itself. And they couldn't charge taxes. They could ask for taxes, and they couldn't charge taxes. And I do like your use of the term allowance and what allows you to do things, because indeed, back in 1787, when they were debating whether or not to shift to a federal government from a confederal government, one of the big issues was taxes. And in fact, what did we see happen in Article 1 of the Constitution? The United States Congress was given the power to tax, right? And how was the Congress selected? By the people and by the state legislature. So where the people had the most power through their state legislature, and they had the most power for direct election, that's where they had the power to tax.
They really thought of everything, it seems, doesn't it?
And yet, at the same time, the stories from over 200 years ago are stories that we experience today. Who has the power, who has the responsibility, and what allows them to do what it is that they need to do with that power and with that responsibility. Jan, thank you so much for sharing your insights about federalism. I really appreciate the time that you took to share your insights with us.
My pleasure.
We've been talking about the concept of federalism and how the Constitution can help us understand the federal system. And that's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.